Everyone, today we're going to have a roundtable on the true cost of content. And hopefully, we have all the experts. And then we talk about the pricing strategies in SaaS CMS. But before we go ahead, George is having issues, so he's going to come on in a little bit. Paula, do you want to kick off the intro about yourself because you kicked off this conversation in the community?
Sure. Thanks, Akshay. My name is Paolo Cuzzo, and I am a director in an agency called Foolproof, and I'm in charge of the content services, so mostly content design, content architecture, and content operations.
All right, Michael, do you want to go next?
Sure. I'm Michael Andrews, and I'm an independent content architect. I've worked both with systems integrators and vendors both, and I've seen how people buy content management solutions from different perspectives.
Mr. Demany?
I'm Mark Demany, and I'm also an independent consultant and currently also working partially for the Mock Alliance. Like Michael, I've worked at a lot of different CMS vendors and also as a CMS vendor customer as well, and happy to be here.
And George?
Everyone, George Chang. I work as a director of digital and web here at Hexagon. So my background has mostly been in public web, obviously a lot of content management systems. So I'm happy to join in here.
Awesome. Thank you, guys. So as we mentioned, the whole conversation started. Paula is selling herself short, which she shouldn't. She asked a very perfect question about pricing in SaaS in the DX community chat. Obviously, these gentlemen all chimed in. That's why they're on here. We had a fun conversation about archiving, security, what's the true cost, and why are we not thinking about API calls and static site generation and anything and everything under the sun. So we thought it's an interesting topic we all talk about, but it's never documented. It's never with these experts on this call. So I think you guys are all experts. So we can start off, but before we do that, Mr. Demany wants to give us a difference between what a PaaS and SaaS is.
Yeah, I think this is important to cover up just up front, and certainly when we're talking about different vendors and pricing models to sort of clarify, hey, that's a very typical SaaS pricing model, and this is a very typical PaaS or on-prem pricing model. By and large, on-prem is usually based upon things like servers. It's really hard to do things that are consumption based because the organization that's implementing that tends to control things around consumption. And usually a lot of SaaS vendors also tend to use things like consumption. But I think we'll discover through this conversation that's very tricky. And good example of that in the early days, a lot of SaaS vendors tend to price off of API calls. And then as Akshay mentioned, like, oh, there's ways of getting around API calls as a pricing model if you're a customer. So then vendors had to go back and come up with new methods of pricing. And so there's all sorts of different pricing levers, and it's a very complex issue. But we sort of wanted to highlight that up front, as certainly when we're having this discussion, often we should make sure to clarify, like, oh, this is more of a SaaS thing or this is more of a PaaS thing, because they're quite different models.
Thank you, sir. And then just to note that during this whole conversation, please add your questions in the chat, and we'll try to answer them. In creating this roundtable, we came up with a lot of questions, a lot of great questions, but we had to also be realistic because it's only an hour. So we narrowed it down to 4, and I don't really know if we can get into all 4, but we'll try to go over it. So the first question, to whoever wants to take it first: what challenges do vendors face in creating a pricing model that aligns with the varied value clients get from the service? I'll call your name if you guys don't go first. Mark, do you want to go first?
Yeah, I think this is actually really getting to the heart of the matter very quickly, which is often that vendors they're trying to base the pricing model essentially based off the value that a customer is getting off of that. And that value that a customer gets might not necessarily have a strong relationship to what it costs the vendor to provide. even in a SaaS sense. And then certainly some things that do cost the vendor more to do maybe aren't things that customers value. For example, just picking one out of my hat, like coming up with a good governance model for content that's very complex and allows different roles and permissions and sub roles based upon things like content type or language. Those are the types of things that an organization that's a multinational retailer would value very, very highly, but another organization that doesn't have multiple geographies or languages would value not at all. And so if you're a vendor that has those features, but you're trying to sell to one of those latter companies, and nobody values that, then you have to come up with different ways of pricing, and that's often where this disconnect comes from, and why you'll often see, certainly at the enterprise tier of functionality, you'll often see vendors say, contact us, because they're trying to figure that out and see what you as an organization value and try to price things holistically so that they get the most money out of you as a customer, but at the same time they don't want to be charging so much that you'll go to a competitor. So it becomes this complex song and dance, and that's really where that's coming from, I think. I don't know, George, I'm going to throw this back to you since we're picking names, because I know you were looking at this saying like,
yeah,
what the heck is going on with vendor pricing?
Yeah. So I'm looking at this. A little background. I used to work in consulting, and now I'm on the customer side. So I'm thinking this from a customer perspective. And I do have to say the enterprise level contact us is like my most hatred thing that I ever see on any price sheet, right? Because it's just like, to me, that's just like, oh, I gotta go talk to a salesperson, and then they're gonna ask me 20 questions. They're not really gonna fully understand, and then they're just gonna. This gives them the ability to just throw any price at me that they want, in a sense, right? Like that's the fear, and I feel like a lot of customers always also have that fear of like, when the pricing isn't transparent to what it is, there's an inherent fear of like wading into those waters, because a lot of times like customers don't have that experience, right? So if a vendor is like, you need X and you need Y and you need Z, and for a lot of customers, they're just like, oh, okay, I guess that's what I need, when in reality that may not be what they need. And I think this is dare I say, one of the advantages of having a partner ecosystem is to help kind of help regulate that a little bit. But I do appreciate the challenge that vendors have in this perspective, right? Because every customer is different. Mark, like you mentioned, you have large multinational enterprise companies, you have smaller mom and pop. How do you adapt to each one? How do you provide the best product for each tier? So I do understand that challenge. I think that, to me, the biggest important thing is just transparency, right? Understanding what I'm actually getting, what I'm actually needing, and kind of putting out line item by line item. One of the hardest things for me to do is take a sales order to our finance team or our procurement team, and it's just like one number, right? It's like license, like $48,000 or whatever it is, without breaking it out what it is. And so having some transparency, I think, is from a customer perspective, is really to me is one of the important driving points here.
Paula, do you guys have any views on this?
I'll say I think it depends a lot on how the customer sees a content management system. So, I mean, there are a lot of customers who just see it as a utility, and they expect that, like electricity or water or something, the content management systems there is just to process a certain amount of material and spit it out, and you can meter that. And they would think about, how much am I using in terms of using, if that's how they look at it, then they get very concerned about these, metrics of, usage metrics. And then the question is, what are the usage metrics that make sense? But going back to Mark's point, if they're thinking about what the impact of content is in an organization, how they get the value out of the content that they're producing, maybe metrics are not, those sort of usage metrics aren't always the appropriate way for them to value a solution that they're getting, because the content itself, the cost of the content is not really in the storage of it. It's not even in the delivery of it. The content's cost is associated with what it is to create, and the value is realized with what business outcomes it supports. And so if you think about content management as a commodity, all you care about are the usage metrics and who gives you the cheapest rate on the usage metrics. But if you don't think of content management as a commodity, because you don't think that content is a commodity, then you start looking at these much more qualitative dimensions. And those dimensions are going to have different prices associated with them, because your content management is not a commodity. What do you think about that, Paula?
No, definitely. And I think that for me was quite a change, because I worked for 5 years in government with a custom built CMS. And then when I came out, the world of CMS had changed. And all of a sudden I had to come to grips with, all the new terminology. And I worked with SaaS type of applications before, but not for content management systems. So I had to catch up quickly, like, what are the new entities? So before it was licenses, before my only decision was how many licenses do I need, to George's point. Now it's all, I need to start figuring out way more many metrics, as Michael said. And I need to figure out exactly how can I put myself in a position where I can control all these metrics across a big organization, because that's the other, I think that's the other complex point for content management systems. In an enterprise setting, there will be many teams accessing it. And so it will be really hard to have a central view of consumption, value, and everything that you need to take into consideration when you think about, am I paying the right amount? So this is definitely where my mind is at right now, also working with clients, and how actually I can help them get in a better position to understand that.
Yeah, I think that's probably one of the first things an organization needs to do, is look at what some of the pricing models are, and then understand organizationally how to align to some of those things. Because I'll kind of compare two vendors who are very close competitively. I don't want to name names, but one kind of prices off of, hey, how many brand footprints do you have? Do you have named domains and brands around these things? And then the other sort of prices around, let's call it content complexity. How many items do you have? How many content models do you have? How many roles do you have? And if you're an organization that shares a lot of content between different brands, but you end up having 10 different brands, vendor A's pricing model is not going to work for you at all, and vendor B's pricing model makes a heck of a lot more sense, because it's sort of aligned to what your footprint looks like as an organization. And I think there is a lot of that out there, and I don't want to be the one throwing this back to customers saying like, oh, they've got to figure this stuff out up front, but I think doing that initial research of what your use case looks like, and starting to poke at different vendors to see what their pricing levers are before you get too far down the evaluation path, I think probably makes a lot of sense. I don't know everybody else if they are sort of seeing the same thing as well from the customer side.
Yeah, I mean, one thing I definitely have, what was new to me, well, I guess new to me is, I guess kind of new to me, was kind of some of these new SaaS platforms and how they kind of, what you were talking about, Mark, pricing on content complexity, right? How many content types and such. I remember a while back I was asking a question in a forum of like, hey, how would you typically model this kind of content, right? And some of the answers coming back were like, well, it depends on how many content types you have and how many content types you have available. Like when your pricing structure is dependent, when you're almost motivated to have to cut corners on your content architecture because of pricing, like that, we feel like that starts to become an issue, right? And so I think there is, to your point, Mark, like there are, I think it really is very much assessing to your needs, right? For someone for an organization has a lot of content complexity, like we have a lot of content complexity, paying by content type probably doesn't make a whole lot of sense. But for people who, we want to throw out a brochure site, and maybe it's multiple brochure sites, right? And they're very basic pages, and we've got some components, right? Maybe then it does make a lot of sense because they don't have very many content types. So, I mean, even from a customer, right, we take that into consideration. And coming from kind of Paolo, same as you, is the kind of license-based pricing model. These are different metrics that we have to now really take into consideration, right? Oh, how many content types do I have? How many users do I actually have, right? How many sites do I actually have? How is this going to balance in the kind of grand scheme of total cost of ownership for this thing? There's just a lot more different metrics to take into consideration as you're evaluating new platforms.
Yeah, to Paula's and Michael's point, value attribution of how this content is important to an org.
Yeah.
It's like a mythical thing, right? So I don't know how that will happen. To Mark and George's point, like in this day and age, for me personally, it's unacceptable to have anything that affects the way you store content as being a restrictive factor to licensing, like content types or the number of authors you can have. It's a SaaS-based system, right? Having 5 people as opposed to 10 people accessing a website to make content changes, I don't know if that makes that big of a difference, but that's the one which bothers me the most, I think, is ever-changing pricing. And then on top of it, it's unpredictable. If they said, it'll increase 5 or 10% every year, here's the contract, great. But then year 2 comes along, we changed our pricing now, and you go to the site and it's just a blanket contact us. You're like, I didn't know your pricing changed. Maybe I should start thinking about, and this is a literal thought that we had a couple of days ago, maybe we should find a free headless CMS out there and just host it ourselves to remove all of the restrictions, and then it won't affect the way we think of content. I don't know how you guys feel about that.
I was just going to say that's a very timely thing to raise. Prismic just changed their pricing model pretty substantially, and Prismic was known as a pretty low cost, good headless SaaS option. And I haven't looked into it, but aside from just seeing the feedback of like, oh, this is a 1,000% increase for this particular metric. And yeah, it's very hard to sort of plan sustainably around that. So yeah, it's tricky.
Yeah, I think it's the thing that is probably confusing for customers is understanding why these metrics exist at all, pricing metrics. They seem very arbitrary to end customers. And a lot of times, customers don't even understand what these metrics are. What is a content type? I mean, that may not even be a familiar concept to people, or some of the other things that we talk about. And the traditional world, we maybe thought about volume of content in terms of web pages. And you could sort of get your head around that. You could count your web pages, or you might have a metric like web traffic, and maybe that represented something that you could understand. And now, really, content technology has changed a lot, and we can construct many web pages from common content. We can access that content in different ways where the traditional site volume is not necessarily representative of how much content is being utilized. But at the same time, the content does have cost associated with it for a vendor. And we can kind of lose sight of that. I mean, obviously the vendor has a lot that they need to invest to create the features and functionality of the content management system, but they also have ongoing costs, right? With their cloud providers with if they are tied in at all with the CDN, they have those kinds of costs. There are, there's a lot of plumbing that's behind the scenes there that the vendor is incurring costs, and they have these own usage metrics that they're needing to basically pass back the cost on as well. So a lot of this is just being generated by the cost structures being generated by how the systems themselves are constructed and the underlying pricing model there. So it's just important to point that out. I'm not saying that it's the best way or the simplest way that it's done, but maybe that will help people understand a little bit what sometimes seems very arbitrary.
Yeah, and I think it's worth pointing out that very little of those vendors metrics actually line up nicely to like what customers are actually going to pay for, because it's like, oh, okay, you've got, to your point, your underlying AWS or GCP or Azure hosting costs, and then you're paying for processing as people are logging in. Nobody wants to pay per minute per user, even though that's kind of what the vendor is paying to their underlying cloud provider. And so that's why they're kind of doing this as a way of sort of abstracting to be able to say, okay, here's some way of covering some of those sort of larger fixed costs for what the vendor spent to develop the thing, and then here's some way of kind of a rough approximation of those additional costs that they're doing to provide the service, and how can we group that into a way that makes a little bit more sense for customers compared to the cold hard costs of what they're running the thing on. But it's still an abstraction and a translation, and they don't always get it right?
Yeah, and just talking about what you guys are talking about, finding the right metric to charge a customer by, right? So we talked about API request limit. One way to get around it is using static site generation, which means when the site builds and you push it to the CDN, you do the request for the API. After that, you barely have to touch API limit, so people are able to get away with it. But on the other hand, there's some vendors who are like, I don't care for the API limits. Give me the traffic that your site gets, and I'm going to charge you by the amount of traffic, which I still can't understand why that's relevant, at least in a headless world, right? So
yeah.
There's complexity there, but in your mind, pros and cons, if you guys have any, on static site generation in terms of how it affects pricing?
Who wants to take this one first?
I'll take a whack at it. I mean, I think your interest in static site generation shouldn't be driven by cost considerations, right? I mean, yeah, static site generation can be a very good approach to improve the performance of your user experience. Potentially, if you implement it properly, it improves the speed at which the customers can get that experience specifically. So, but to Akshay's point, I mean, it does have some pricing implications depending upon how the vendor has set up their pricing model. So if people are interested in static site generation as a way of avoiding cost, well, that's sort of an interesting motivation, but I wouldn't say it's really the one that they should be leading what they're doing. I think, though, we also will want to talk a little bit about what the implications of static site generation are for how people create and deliver content. Because I think originally my understanding was static site generation was, okay, we're going to take a web page and we'll make a copy of this web page essentially available at different delivery at different locations, and then those endpoints will be very close to where the customers need to access it in the cloud. So you had a static page, and now I think with so much of our content being delivered in say mobile apps, which are much more interactive, or we're starting to get much more programmatic in how say, e-commerce sites are deciding what recommendations for products that they're giving and stuff like that, you have to think not in terms of a static page, but we have to think about how that content is getting made available and how quickly it can be made available. So if you no longer are, at the source there making those sorts of decisions about what content to deliver, but you're doing it on what they call the edge, we need to have a way to make sure that the content can be interactive at the edge if you're using a static site approach. And I think vendors are starting to offer options around that, but and it's really cool that they are. But again, I would expect there's some costs associated with making that kind of available and Plex.
Oh, there he is.
Yeah. Go ahead, Mark. Yeah.
Yeah, let's see what else. I mean, it's interesting because it was almost like this back and forth in the very early days of SaaS CMS. It seemed like API consumption was by far the easiest metric and sort of, again, more closely related to the underlying cost to actually provide that as a vendor. And then static site generation came along as a technique, and vendors, I think most vendors have now abandoned API pricing. I think they have it as a sort of fair use policy to say, if you exceed it at a certain level, they can go back to you. But, by and large, it's no longer one of the major levers in calculation. So I think it has kind of bounced back and forth a little bit. And, to Michael's point, I think there are benefits to SSG approaches. There are some trade-offs to it as well, particularly for things like rendering time for preview. And now some of the approaches now kind of start to combine both of those things. Like you'll have a static site approach sort of for your initial serving of content, but then any subsequent updates on the page through the DOM may go to the API or may go to some other cached version of that content. And so it's, there's definitely echoing Michael's point. There's two things to separate out. Like there is potentially a pricing implication or maybe less of that nowadays. But there's also that implication of, are these approaches meeting your use case? And you should evaluate and understand those things separately, I think.
George or Paula, any input on this?
Yeah, I mean, I generally agree. I see kind of static site generation as, I see kind of content as content, right? This is the repository of content, and this is kind of what we're leaning on these SaaS CMS providers for. And then we have kind of your multiple channels, right? Your multiple heads of content, of which web is one of them. Mark and Michael have talked about, mobile and any other channels that we might have. From a web perspective, kind of given what Mark was talking about, the slow degrade of using APIs count as a pricing metric, right? Now it becomes a purely almost purely technical kind of question of, does this make sense for your site for kind of what you're doing, right? If you have a lot of personalization, right? Are you doing that personalization on the edge, or is it kind of hitting back through an API call, or whatever the case might be? It becomes more of a kind of what would work from a technical perspective for your use case more than anything else, and that kind of reliance on what your underlying headless CMS system, your SaaS CMS system, that reliance has kind of gone down a lot significantly, right? Because those two things are, which used to be so married to each other, are a lot more separated from each other because of this.
And it seems, for me personally, right, everything seems like everyone's made equal progresses. So people have visual editing now, like everything seemed to be kind of leveled out. But what other factors make sense in terms of pricing, right? Like self-help, training, technical support, customer support. Like, what do you guys think makes for that additional oomph that one provider has as opposed to another in terms of their pricing?
Yeah, I mean, I'll kick this one off. I mean, I think, I looked at this as, so the company I work for, we do SaaS software, right? And so we have this conversation a lot within our marketing teams of, how do you retain that customer? When there's competition out there, when your recurring revenue is based on a very, kind of the whims of the customer and how well you're providing to the customer. And to me, right, this idea of customer service, technical support, training, just usability, all this stuff, that's the differentiator, right? Actually, to your point, we've all kind of hit this kind of middle ground of, everyone can kind of do everything in a very similar fashion. You go to probably the top 5 SaaS-ish CMS companies and you go, try to build a site there. They probably won't admit it to you, but they all feel generally pretty much the same, right? More or less. I think where the differentiator really is, how do you make your customer succeed, right? What can you do to enable your customer into success, right? Your underlying kind of content database, right? In a sense is just that, but how do you use that? How do you leverage that, whether through your technology, through your programs, through your enablement, through your whatever, to be able to use that as your foundation to help your customers succeed, right? And I think to me, that's, for any SaaS company, that's the differentiating factor, right? Like is the experience, is the guidance, is anything you look at, you look at all these social media networks, right? They're up one day, down another, up one day, down another. And why is that? Sometimes it's sometimes it's based on the whims of the market, but sometimes it really is like, what does this product provide that is a better experience for a user versus not as good of an experience for a user. And so I feel like the SaaS market, just in general, is kind of on this kind of on the whims of how you let your customers and your users succeed, and the SaaS CMS market is really no different.
If I can add something on this from a customer perspective, I think that buyers should really help vendors help them, and I don't think they always do that. So I think that with new tools, with the SaaS market, you will find that more and more organizations start creating platform teams, internal platform teams, where you have a team which is responsible for that technology. That doesn't always happen with the CMS, because there's a bit of a generic thing, like, oh, it's the marketing team, or oh, it's the authors. So what's missing, it's an internal knowledge of content management, which is slightly different than content publishing, which is what everyone is very focused on. Now, if you can get a platform team internally that is responsible for that technology, they could do that due diligence that Mark was mentioning before buying something. They can start getting some initial thoughts and requirements. They can start looking at usage. They can start measuring things. They can start getting requests from the rest of the company, and they can start prioritizing these requests. Like, this is a good one. This is actually we're not going to do. So buyers, organizations need to start thinking about centralizing some of the decisions. Which doesn't mean that you have to have one content team. It's not that, but you need to create that platform capability if you want to do things like omnichannel, if you want to do things like personalization, because it's not just one team that's going to do that. So you need to centralize this. And this is where I think things like customer success from the vendor side can really help, because then customer success can work with the client and give them suggestions. This would be maybe the best way. And this is where you start working with sales engineers to do technical spikes. But organizations need to take this a bit more seriously than they've done so far.
I think that's one of the big advantages now of the SaaS world. Like, I think we've all been around long enough that, previously when you were doing evaluations of content management, it was a very long process, and you'd have your giant RFP and you'd send that to the vendors and they would answer it and they would say yes to everything, or, yes with customization to everything else that they didn't offer out of the box. And then you'd have demos, and then, it would be a very long, intensive process. And I think now, I really love this on the vendor side for both sides. Most vendors have a free version, or you get a 2-week trial, and you can actually test out the software, and you can actually build things, and you can actually look at the documentation. And so much of that now makes that evaluation process a lot easier. But to your point, Paula, like, you need to pick that up on the customer side to meet them halfway. But I think that's a much better model overall, because then you really can start to properly evaluate those intangibles around documentation and the community, and what add-ons there are, and what that authoring interface feels like in the real world. Like, authoring is a very, very hard thing to really evaluate. You can't do that by looking at it in a demo, and that was kind of how we did things before. And I think that's one of those areas that there's a very wide set of vendors and capabilities and how they meet the content authoring needs, both in terms of what they give out of the box, but then also how far you can take that and extend that to meet customized requirements. And those are very different. And I think that's one of those areas that you as an organization need to figure that out yourself. Like, what are your content authoring needs? But at least you can nowadays much easier than you used to be able to. I'm sure Michael has a lot to comment on that.
Well, I'll set aside the content authoring for a moment, but I just wanted to get back to the idea about the old world, where we had that arduous selection process that we talked about, and the customization and that sort of thing. And on the plus side, I think the buyer was getting very engaged with what they were buying. On the downside, though, it often led to a lot of lock-in, because they ended up building something that was a combination of vendor decisions and their own decisions around how they're customizing what they needed at that time. And the SaaS model is a much more of an arm's length kind of relationship between the SaaS vendor and the customer. Hey, sure, you can do a trial, do whatever you want, set it up. Here's our documentation, go read it. It is an arm's length, and so you have a lot more choice, and you can even switch vendors. And I think that's why a lot of the SaaS products seem very similar. But I think to Paola's comment is that you're not investing the organization in what it is that they're buying, because it's just a credit card payment in a way. And it's how is this different than subscribing to Apple News or subscribing to some sort of consumer product, when it's just a recurring payment that you make every month or every year or whatever. So I think that's really one of the gaps that we have right now, is that people don't really appreciate how much they need to invest their own requirements and expectations to get the value out of the general capabilities that they're buying. And only when they make that investment and they implement it in a way that truly matches their needs, because they got to do that to get the real value out of it, will that happen.
Yeah, a couple of things I want to tie in, because you guys said wonderful things, and I want to make sure I get all of this. So because of the API first world, document first, free trial, so you can evaluate, being able to switch a lot easier and not be locked in as it was before, not seeing CMS as a utility. And one thing Mark Temney said, which is super important, is you can evaluate the community around the provider that you are purchasing to see what kind of support you get on top of the technical support, on top of everything else. It is nowadays, all of them have their own Discords or Slack. So it's a good way for you to say, you know what, I posted a question to customer support. I got an answer in 3.5 minutes. I didn't have to create a support ticket and wait for 3 days for it. I posted it in the community Slack or Discord, and I got an answer back. It gives you that sense of, you know what, I'm going to be okay. Let me try it out with the 30-day trial or 14-day trial. So I do want to mention that those are very valid points.
Yeah, I mean, as almost like a testimonial, that's exactly what we did a few months ago, right? We took a bunch of these kind of SaaS CMS providers. We're like, all right, we're going to take a look at each one of these, right? Assess them, evaluate them, right? That's how we kind of all figured out that, you know, the differences aren't so much the underlying technology or anything like that, right? That's effectively commoditized to some extent, but really it's, you know, the support that you're able to get, the you know, the community around things, right? Just the overall ecosystem of making sure that or to be able to support you and to make you successful in what you're trying to do. Because at the end of the day, right, the process, your business leaders aren't going to care so much about the process. How did it get there, right? It's going to be how successful your end product really is, right? And that all is, you know, that kind of flows all the way back to how successful are you in implementing whatever that you're implementing? How successful are you in defining your, you know, your content architecture, and you know how easily that is, that translates to your content authors for how they do things, right? And so, you know, I mean, actually, you make a really good point, right? Which is that ecosystem of support is super important, right? Because that's to me like the differentiating factor, right? That's what's going to, you know, that's the difference between really succeeding in what you're trying to do and just crashing and burning. You could be on, you know, two people on the same platform and wind up with very different outcomes based on, you know, how much they're engaging with that support, how much they're in that community, how much help they're getting, how, you know, and you know, of course, there's a little bit of kind of self motivation to go do that and go seek that out a little bit, but you know, having a place to seek out is super important.
No, makes sense. Michael, did you have something to say?
Yeah, I just maybe on the topic of community, I think it's important, but we want to differentiate maybe the technical support community from the end user author support community, because I mean, I think the technical folks are pretty comfortable getting on Discord and asking the question, and they have a, you know, a particular set of needs there. But you know, if we go back to the end users who are creating content and things like that, I don't think you know, a crowdsourced community support model is really going to work for those kinds of people. They need training. You know, they need a higher touch level of service, and that's one of the things that, you know, is unfortunate. Going back to our question about the pricing, is, you know, how do you provide good end user support, not for the technical folks who maybe have a bit more independence, but for the people who are using, you know, the system just for their daily work, and they need the training, and they need to understand how they can make changes that they need, and things like that. And you know, some vendors will have that as a bolt-on. You know, okay, you can buy you know, our package and get so much support a month, or you know, there are different models for that. But you know, oftentimes people are reluctant to have to pay extra for that, right? It's sort of like, okay, well, if this product needs extra support, maybe it's not the right product to begin with, or you know, so it you know, people want things but don't necessarily want to pay for things, and you know, that's sort of a conundrum I think vendors face.
Yeah, I'm gonna echo that, and maybe even like be more emphatic about it. Like, especially in the headless era, so many of the vendors target everything to developers, like both from like the high level messaging right down to where documentation is and what it is. And it, you know, I think this is one of those things that as people are evaluating vendors, like, try to look at the documentation, and sometimes it will be under like developer, and you know, content creation will be sort of alongside other things like, you know, accessing the APIs, and like, that's not great. And then other vendors will intentionally say, okay, here's creator documentation and developer documentation and actually have videos and get into it as well. So, and I think that's a really good proxy for understanding where content creators fit in the vendor's view of the world. Because, to Michael's point, like in some cases, buyers are reducing content management down to like, oh, it's a content database. And some vendors as well are also reducing that function down to being the best content database they can possibly be, when in fact content management as a practice and content creation is much more complex than that. So, making sure that the vendor's sort of philosophical view about what they're providing and where it fits in your organization is also pretty key as well. And yeah, I think this is, especially now with headless and SaaS vendors, that's much more of an issue than it used to be. I think, not to like shake my fist at a cloud as one of the old men in the room, but I think like older CMS providers, because they were doing things like creating pages, they sort of understood the publishing and creation task a little bit more than headless vendors might. So I think that is one of the kind of interesting things right now. And actually you mentioned that as well. Like, okay, now some of the headless providers are starting to get back to that and doing content creation tools and content planning tools and page layout tools. So it is coming back, but there definitely was a pendulum swing there for a little while.
Yeah, I also do want to mention that I know the pricing aside, I do know that point, Michael, for training as well as advanced support you have to pay. But I will say though that a couple of the headless vendors, they have the chat in the admin console, right? And what's surprising is the customer, the authors are able to self-serve using that, whether it's a question which is super technical or whether I'm trying to set up a workflow and this is stuck in the publishing workflow, but it's not doing anything. That kind of helps from a partner perspective. We are fielding a lot less calls because they're able to self-serve as well. So even though you pay for the support, I do feel like the chat support icon on a couple of the vendors I've used, they're able to service the technical users as well as the non-technical, which is also very, very important. Paolo, you had something to say. Sorry if I cut you off.
No worries. I think that just to maybe say something, again, I think I put a little bit of responsibility also on the buyers though, because it's hard to write guidelines and documentation for end users, mostly because for some CMSs, you might have customization of certain things, you might have specific workflows, and some of the authors might need more hand-holding than whatever documentation a vendor can provide. So this is why I think that I work with this concept of platform team with some of my clients, and that seems to work really well because these platform teams can provide also the first response for users, because usually it's something quite trivial, but they're missing something on a very specific template that it's being created with a very specific workflow, and it might be harder for a vendor or system integrator to have a say on that. So I think, again, there's part of it that I think organizations need to take on as their own responsibility, and obviously vendors should support them in teaching the teacher. And then, but I think that could help minimizing a bit the disruption that the new system brings.
Yeah, no, that makes sense, especially if we all say that headless CMS, it's multi-channel, but not many people use it for more than the web channel, right? So, and headless is not supposed to know how my page is supposed to look, but to create a component, the headless vendor is not going to know what the partner built, but the customer does. So yeah, providing a different venue for documentation is super important. Like in your guys' mind, like how transparent is SaaS pricing? So to me, like my personal view is it was transparent. There were 2-3 boxes and then call me. And then now it's trending more towards call me. Like what are some of the hidden costs or things customers should be keeping an eye on? George, since you went through the exercise, I'm going to call on you, and you can call on whoever you want to after that.
Okay, sounds good. No, I mean, yeah, we did go through the exercise, right? And I think this I'll also be an old man shaking my fist at a cloud, right? This kind of shift from this monolith where everything was kind of all batteries included type of um, type of system where you really didn't have to worry too much about where you're going to host your site and this and that, and to now this kind of distributed composable idea. There's a lot more things that you have to take into consideration, right? Even educating some of our internal teams here. They're like, oh, we'll just get a CMS and we'll build a website on top of it, and then we're done. It's like, well, actually, your CMS isn't actually going to be a website. It's you have to go build a website, and you have to get front end hosting, and you have to we have to get a new development team and this and that, and like there's a lot of, I wouldn't necessarily call them hidden costs, but I think costs that aren't necessarily covered in the tier 1, tier 2 contact us boxes in the headless CMS space. That gets you I think there's a general kind of buyer education of that only gets you part way there, right? That gets you some content on the site. Okay, now you have APIs, right? And now you have to go build a site, and that site has to be hosted somewhere, and then that site may be pushed to the edge, and so you have the CDN network, and get to all the technical bits and pieces, and then kind of on the previous topic a little bit of you could have a very different implementation from one person to the next of how that is. So now you have, content author training, right? And almost a very specialized content author training, and change management that has to go along with it. You need additional types of roles, right? Someone who knows how to do content data modeling, for instance, or content architecture. And it starts to snowball a little, is what it kind of feels like. And so I think it's more of a general education and not necessarily a SaaS specific, like SaaS CMS specific type of thing of knowing kind of what that total cost of ownership is, right? Again, of course, I mentioned kind of early on that the contact us banner on a website is always my least favorite thing, right? But at the same time, right, it's there are some vendors that I've discovered that that the contact us does include some things that you otherwise wouldn't necessarily get in your first 2 boxes of the very transparent pricing. And maybe the vendor does offer some form of front end hosting or something, and that's just a conversation to be had. But I think in general, just understanding kind of what that total cost of ownership of this of moving to kind of a SaaS CMS is super important from a buyer and customer perspective. That a vendor may or may not necessarily be able to inform you on all the details of that, right?
No, absolutely. You kind of got into what I was going to ask next, and it kind of covers all of that. Like people trying to transition from PaaS to SaaS or from traditional CMS to new CMS, right? What the most annoying part is education in all of it. People, like, depending on who you talk in the organization, they just see it as, well, I just need content on the website and that's pretty much it. And they tend to forget the whole content production behind it, like archiving content, legal, going through like process and workflows. So what are, like, this is probably the last question we're going to do because we're at 53 minutes, but what are some of your advice for people who are looking to take the plunge, looking into options, into moving more towards not SaaS-ish, like George is saying, but true SaaS CMSs? Like, what are the gotchas they should be aware of? George covered quite a bit, is just to look at everything, including, do you have developers? Are you going to pick the right technology? Is there anything else you would advise people to look into?
I think a lot of this has to do with the maturity of the organization that's adopting whatever it is that they're evaluating. And one of the simplest ways to see whether it's a good fit or not is to look at the usability of whatever systems you're considering. And if it feels like they're usable, it probably is something that's going to be a good fit for your organization. If the usability doesn't feel comfortable to you, that's probably an indication that So, you can manage your cost if you understand what it is you're managing. But if you don't understand what you're managing, you're never going to manage your costs.
Yeah, I like Michael's point about that as well. Like there's different CMSs and even headless CMSs kind of have different philosophies about how certain things should work, how content modeling should work, how the assembly of content should work, how the extension of that authoring experience should work. And, for example, like implementing Storyblock, their content modeling and their way of like building blocks and components is philosophically quite different than something like Contentful or content.ai. And so kind of understanding those things is pretty important. And I think, as we've been saying, the nice thing is you can actually start to play around with those things yourself and understand that. And I think doing that firsthand always beats a vendor demo. Like, if you can get a vendor demo, great. But, road testing that for your organization, I think is really helpful. Mind you, that's not always necessarily easy to get. It's a little bit of a tangent, but like when we're seeing pricing models and there's kind of like the, tier 1, tier 2, tier 3, and tier 3 is always contact us. It's usually because tier 1 and tier 2 you can pay for by a credit card, and intentionally it will be sort of harder to get a vendor's attention. Like the idea is you're going to pay for that yourself, and engaging salespeople is expensive on the vendor side. So for them, that's kind of that filter to be able to say, is it worth our time to engage with this person? And that's kind of where the contact us comes into. But that's also where you can really kind of dig into, a deeper explanation about how people like sales engineers at the vendor would implement things to meet certain use cases. So, if you are at that level that you're sort of hitting enterprise pricing and features, it probably is worth engaging because, yes, it will be more work, but you will probably learn something along the way as well, right?
No, absolutely. And we have a question. Anyone else to finish out the question before?
Just requirements, doing some due diligence beforehand on requirements, and maybe investing in skills. If you don't have, as to Michael's point, you might not have a particularly mature organization. This is the time to invest in skills, to at least having a direction of travel, if not requirements.
Makes sense. So we have a question from LinkedIn. It says total cost of ownership makes sense when moving from on-prem monolith to SaaS, but what about comparing SaaS vendors? How reliable are the numbers from vendors? It's not as if it's a standard test like when stating the miles per gallon for a vehicle. What do you guys' take on that?
Well, even in the old days, it was never easy to do total cost of ownership, right? TCO, like, yes, there was more bundled into the vendor pricing, but, as everybody knows on this call, the vendor pricing would be, a quarter to, a fifth of the overall project. So, it was never easy. I think George made the excellent point that you do have to understand all of those individual bits and pieces. And, if you need something like a CDN, are you going with a vendor that has some more of those capabilities, or are you not? And are you providing your own? Are you doing things like static site generation? Are you doing things like static site generation that the vendor is providing most of the computation? Like, the user that asked the question is absolutely right. Like, there's no standard miles per gallon simple metric for any of this stuff, and even for individual features within that. So it is hard. I'll also echo what Michael was saying as well. You shouldn't just be looking at this as a commodity. You really should be looking at it as, what is the value of this tool relative to the value of content within your organization. So that's probably where I'll shut up and let Paolo and Michael chime in, because I know they have more on the topic.
There was also, Michael, remind me if I'm wrong, wasn't there an article you posted which talks about figuring out the value across like a matrix on all the vendors or something like that recently? I remember.
Well, I was looking at some folks at Microsoft have looked at how to evaluate the usability of SaaS products, and they've come up with a rating scale for that. And I think the value of that really is that you have to think about the cost of utilization as much as cost of ownership. So, there are these intangibles like usability. And if you have hundreds of users who are, each costing you, $100+ an hour to use your product, and your product is causing them to not accomplish what they need to do, that's going to be a much bigger cost, maybe even than your. Just consider that.
Thanks, Michael. Last thoughts, Paula and George, on this?
Yeah, no, I mean, I totally agree with Michael. Having been on both sides of the fence, there is a customer cost to, like a usage cost, usability cost to everything, and something to definitely take into consideration.
Awesome. Thank you so much, guys. Paula, Mark, Michael, George, for your time. I think it was useful. I don't think we got through the other half of the questions, but I think we kind of covered quite a bit of things in here. Thank you so much for your time, guys. Have a good rest of your day.
Thank